And with that, we'll start with our conversation. So I'm going to invite Sephora to come in here first to talk about the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative, explain, why this production gap report, which I mentioned previously, that suggests we need to wind down fossil fuel production by 120%, hasn't yet been taken up by the international system, and why you think there's such a need for a fossil fuel treaty.
Thanks, Alex. And it's great to be here. Everybody, I not only work with Stand.Earth, I'm also chair of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative. I was having trouble typing. It's been a big week, like Friday. Whew. It's been a very big week. Lots of ups and downs, given the Leadership Climate Summit. But honestly, when I started working on this, Alex, I thought I was a little bit crazy. Because I'd been working on climate policy for decades, and it was always about emissions reductions and demand side changes. And I think the theory with climate policy for over 30 years now has been demand for fossil fuels will get reduced. We'll put in policies to constrain emissions of fossil fuels, and the markets will constrain production. Eventually, the price will go down. Of renewables, the price will go up. For fossil fuels, carbon price will go up and demand will go down, and the market will then, projects will start getting canceled. And the problem is it's not working. Well, and it's not working fast enough to keep us safe. And it's in part because governments are really distorting the markets. Governments are subsidizing fossil fuels. They're buying fossil fuel projects. They're keeping this industry alive, even though renewables are cheap. And so we have demand side policy, but we don't have production or supply side policy. And, on almost every other issue that humans have tried to deal with, especially through the markets, you need what's called both sides of the scissors, both demand and supply. And so a couple of years ago, the UNEP and Stockholm Environment Institute started really looking at this and saying, okay, well, how many fossil fuels are we producing? And they found that we're producing 120% more fossil fuels than the world can ever burn in a Paris-aligned scenario. And it's part of why we've been proposing the treaty, because countries can, and subnational, all levels of government can put in place policies that can start to constrain supply. But it's very difficult for them to do. And unless it happens simultaneously, someone's just going to start producing more. So Denmark says they won't do oil drilling, somewhere else will do more oil drilling. And there are going to be some countries that aren't going to have the capacity to constrain production because they're just producing in order to feed their debts. So that's where the issues of equity and justice come into account. The bottom line is that the Paris negotiations are about negotiating the space left we have in the atmosphere for pollution. And the treaty and this work on production is about negotiating who's producing what and for how long. Why is our financial capital and our political capital and our intellectual capital on this planet going to digging up more out of the ground when we know we not only already have enough, but we actually can't burn the majority of what's still being dug up? And it's in fact, civil society with the Keep It in the Ground movement, indigenous leadership from the Amazon to the Arctic have gotten this for decades and have been calling for it to be kept in the ground. But we didn't have any international agreements or policy frameworks for governments to figure out what to do with those calls. And so that's what we're trying to create with the treaty. We're trying to create the framework for international negotiations so that governments can cooperate on constraining not just fossil fuel emissions, but fossil fuel production.
Well, thank you for that, Sephora. And that's, I think, a point I'd love you to come in on here, Evelyn. If we think about different countries and their capacity to wind down fossil fuel production, and expand access to clean energy and low carbon, low impact solutions, when it comes to oil, gas, and coal, how would you think? Do you have a way of thinking about which countries are best placed to take action, which countries might need support, and how that support might be facilitated in addressing this?
Thank you, Alex. I think before we go into the issue of capacity, we should also recognize that some countries have a greater responsibility to wind down fossil fuel. So the climate crisis we are facing today is due to how the rich developed country has overspent the atmospheric carbon budget, which Sephora mentioned just now. Up to 2015, Global North was responsible for 92% of excess emissions. So as far as capacity is concerned, this will have to come from the wealth that the developed countries have accumulated from the unconstrained emissions that they've done in the past. Therefore, the UN Convention and the UN Climate Convention and the Paris Agreement recognizes the equity principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, where developed countries must take the lead in emissions reduction. And these should be deep emission cuts at source, not some misleading, hollow net zero pledges. So developing countries must meet many basic needs of their people as to provide jobs, healthcare, education, etc. In some developing countries, the poor communities are still suffering from energy poverty, such as India, who don't have access to energy at all to begin with. So we agree that there is no more carbon space for countries to go on emitting with total disregard, but we must buckle down on just transition and manage phase out. So developing countries have to wind down their fossil fuel dependency, but they cannot do this without the necessary financial resources, technology transfer, and capacity building to help them leap into these lower carbon development pathways. So there's no excuse for the rich developed countries to continue emitting. They have the highest capacity to fund just transition without the need for international support, unlike the developing countries, which have very low capacity to phase out due to their high dependency on international support to do so. So this is already very well articulated in the study titled Equity, Climate Justice, and Fossil Fuel Extraction, co-authored by Greg Mutted and Stephen Carter from SEI. Thanks, Alex.
Thanks for that, Evelyn. We'll try and get that in the chat as well, so you can read that paper. It is quite helpful in thinking about different categories of countries and what their dependency looks like on fossil fuels. There was also a study that came out this year from the Carbon Tracker Initiative, which suggested that there are 19 countries that they call highly vulnerable to changes in oil prices because the income from oil makes up, I think it's more than 50% of their government budget. So there's this huge dependency, and there are 400 million people live in those countries. And so we really need to be thinking about how do we ensure a transition in terms of the structure of the government and economy for those 400 million people. Candy, I might come to you, knowing that social movements and frontline communities across the world have been standing up and stopping the expansion of fossil fuels for decades at the source. Why is it important, do you think, also to have this global call for a treaty or global framework to phase out fossil fuels and fast track the fair energy transition for you in the United States, but also across the world?
Well, first of all, I want to say Dosha, Margowitz, Marashima Ishuya Hetz. And so in my Hidatsa language, I said, hello, relatives. My name is Eagle Woman. My English name is Candy White. Some of you might remember me as Candy Mossett. And I just want to do a big shout out to all the organizers behind the Power Shift Network and everybody that's been working all these years for so long. I was one of the OGs back in 2007 when there was Energy Action Coalition and we were holding these Power Shift conferences. And it's just a reminder of how youth have a voice and, take that power to make our voices heard, even when we grow up and have our own youth. Like me, I have 2 kids now and teaching them, the ways of how to move forward. My daughter was only 3 months old when I was a speaker at one of the Pennsylvania Power Shift conferences. And so the tradition continues. And I think that what we're seeing now, especially in the US, especially for me, I'm Mandan Hiradza Rikra. I'm from North Dakota, which is a huge fossil fuel state. We have coal, and uranium, and of course, oil and gas with the Bakken formation that is there. And unfortunately, there have been situations where our tribal leaders have been put into positions where we've become economically dependent on our own cultural destruction. we are forced to choose between poverty or signing a lease. And if we're told, we're being disrespectful if we push back against the industry. And it's just very, very, very heartbreaking. There's a lot of apathy that exists. And so it's very, very important that our youth step up, because everybody else's hands are tied. Our tribal councils are unfortunately not all protectors of the land. It's a romantic notion, that all Native people are, spiritual and pray and, care about the land. But in reality, there's a lot of assimilation. There's a lot of acculturation. And that's certainly true on the, reservations in the US, but also around the world with people in positions of power. So we don't really have a choice. We need a treaty that will help hold an accountability on a global level that we can stand on as young people, as youth, as people that don't necessarily agree with those in positions of power that are making decisions on our behalf when they might not even be here in 50 years. And they're certainly not going to be here to be able to speak up for our kids. My son is 2 years old and doesn't have a voice in this fight. What can I hand him? What kind of tool can he have? This type of a treaty, which hopefully sticks. We have over 400 treaties in the US with this government, and we need a treaty that we can make them adhere to, that's binding, and something that we can hand our kids and say, we got this, so let's run with it. And so that's just a little bit of a nutshell of why this treaty is so important to a lot of us that are organizing to protect our land, air, and water now and for future generations.
Thank you for sharing that, Candy, and it certainly made me think also about the voices of my children, and so I really appreciate you bringing that into our discussion. And this might be actually a good kickoff for Sephora to share on what we're thinking about the three pillars of our proposed and ideal treaty, what it would set out to do and bind governments to actually do.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. I got totally distracted by thinking about kids. When I started this work, I didn't have kids either. And now I have 6'2" giant man boys. And one of my sons is now an activist with 350 and XR. So the next generation, yay. The Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty initiative starts from the learning from other global treaties. And so we really looked at nuclear non-proliferation, at landmines, at other treaties and how they were created, and why they were created. And there's a lot of parallels with nuclear weapons. Again, it was this moment in history where the world was racing to produce more and more and more of something that was killing us. And that represented a global security threat. But no one wanted to stop unless everyone else did. And it's a very similar situation now. We make this so complicated in the climate world, right? But 80% of the emissions that are trapped in our atmosphere come from three products: oil, gas, and coal. And we now know that we can replace them. We can build renewable energy at scale. We have the technology to do that. We also have the capacity to do that. And we have enough fossil fuels already dug up out of the ground in the system while we transition to a renewable energy future. So the question is, how do you make that happen? So the first pillar, similar to nuclear non-proliferation, is to end expansion. We need to, it's like with the weapons analogy, it's like you need to get countries to all say simultaneously, okay, put down your weapons. And so the first pillar is about ending expansion. So and our work right now in the first pillar is really around, how do you define that? First of all, who's expanding and where? And does a new permit mean expansion, or does a project that's already construction mean expansion? And how do you define reserves? There's all these big questions that are really resolved in part because not governments aren't doing it and the UN isn't doing it. So one of the core projects that we've created is the Global Registry of Fossil Fuel Production, which is now a standalone project. It's going to be run by Carbon Tracker and Global Energy Monitor. And basically, we're trying to ensure accountability and transparency on who's producing what and who's planning on producing what. And despite the ideas that we know of the carbon budget, we haven't had that, which is kind of crazy. You know, we know emissions, countries have to report emissions, but they don't have to report production. So the basis of the first pillar is preventing further proliferation of oil, gas, and coal, ending new exploration. And the second pillar is literally around disarmament. So how do you phase out the existing stockpiles? How do you stop using fossil fuels? If we stop today, all the fields would naturally decline. They're a finite resource. But if you add in this equity layer that Evelyn was talking about, then how much should each country get to produce? How do we do the phase out globally? And how do we support, especially countries in the global south, in doing that phase out? Because in some cases, they're so dependent for their GDP, for feeding their debt, et cetera, based on production. So that's the work that would be done in the second pillar. And the third pillar is around the just transition. It's around fast tracking the good stuff that we know we need and making sure that no one's left behind. No worker, no family is left behind. There's a lot of conversation these days about just transition, which is great, but most of the conversations are based within a nation state. So they're about how is this country going to deal with just transition? No one's talking about what the global agreements need to be for just transition. And so that's part of the work within the third pillar of the treaty, is to really look at international cooperation to ensure a just transition, because that's going to be necessary. A lot of countries cannot diversify their economy on their own. And especially if we want to support countries in leaping over the fossil fuel era, going right to the good stuff, that's going to take support from other countries, especially when there's so many people right now that don't even have access to energy around the world. So this is about going forwards, not backwards, and it's about fast tracking the solutions. And so there's a number of different ways we do that. One is through international cooperation and agreements. One is also through money transfers. What are these big institutions like the IMF and the World Bank? What are they funding? And where does that money go? Right now, they don't have formal agreements and formal decisions to not fund, for example, fossil fuel production. And a lot of the agreements, the financial agreements that the world has, is increasing fossil fuel production instead of renewables. So we need to make sure that our international agreements, our national laws, and also our financial decisions are all pushing towards the fast tracking of renewables, and that's the third pillar of the treaty.
Thank you, Sephora. So I think we've had some good introductory pieces here about this idea of a global treaty and why different groups across the world are calling for it and the logic behind it. We might have another video because it's not only folks on this call who are making it, but we've had some high-profile endorsements this week that we're excited about and want to share. So I'll pass to Brenner again to share a video. Thanks, Brenna. So, yeah, as you could see this week, 101 Nobel laureates, including His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama, as well as several former presidents of oil-producing states, actually, Colombia and Timor-Leste, as well as scientists, peacemakers, community leaders, all of the fields that you can get a Nobel Prize for, which I don't even know how many there are, endorse this call to the presidents that were meeting at President Biden's World Leaders on Climate Summit. So I thought maybe we could do a quick round of the three of you. It's been a very big week of climate news, and maybe you could share a good thing, a bad thing, and either an ugly, like really bad thing, or a ray of hope that keeps you going over the weekend and beyond. So we'll start with you, Candy, if you're feeling ready to respond.
Sure, I'm feeling ready. I'm probably gonna steal yours, Sephora, because I wanted to talk about the recent ban by the governor in California. But so it's a ban on new fracking by 2024, so ban on new permits, and then by 2045, a ban on oil and gas. So, I mean, come on, that's a step in the right direction. Woohoo! And I think that was just today, literally right when we were getting on this panel.
Like an hour ago.
Yeah. And so I was, we were on a chat group and we're like, okay, how do we make sure this actually happens? And, we're always on the defense. We're always like, is it going to go through? Is somebody going to try to step in and change it? But it's very exciting. So that's a good thing. Bad thing, the climate summit, kind of wishy-washy, just a little bit, just a teeny bit in terms of what the US is committing to. I want to go personal though. I want to go local. So I'm from a reservation, so-called Fort Berthold, and our tribal leaders are right in the midst of oil and gas development. And so are actually fighting to keep fracking, fighting to keep the Dakota Access Pipeline up and running and operating, because of if we don't have it, it'll take away our economic independence, is what they say. And so that's bad news. And, our tribal chairman just came out with a statement talking about how in order to protect our land, air, and water, we need this pipeline. Because if we don't have the pipeline, then, we'll have to revert to semi-trucks or trains. Like the reality that they're being forced into is an either or situation, which is why we need to ban fracking in general across the US, across the world. And I see that happening. I'm just a little concerned that it's not fast enough. We're seeing sicknesses, we're seeing diseases, we're seeing a lot of cancers. We just buried our matriarch of our movement last past weekend. LaDonna Braypo Allard was so instrumental in getting so many people to stand up and say water is life and to fight back. And Standing Rock in 2016 was a huge movement, but you saw how it ended. The militarized industrial complex, the police from 28 different states forced us out by gunpoint. And a lot of us are young people, a lot of us totally peaceful, totally unarmed. And the industry, Energy Transfer, was protected by the police, by the military. And here, they weren't even operating legally. They didn't even have their own legally required permit. So it's just like, and I kept saying the system is broken, but at the Indigenous Environmental Network, it's like, actually the system is a colonized system meant to keep us in check. So it's working just right for them. And recognizing that and standing up and saying, okay, we're changing this. It's a fight that a lot of us are fighting, but we need a lot more. So I'll just check there and let you pass it on.
No, thank you, Candy. Thank you for sharing that. And that analysis is spot on. This is the system currently working, and that's really at the core of the problem. Evelyn, would you like to share?
Thank you, Alex. Yeah, I think of all the times that I've been involved in climate change activism, this week is perhaps the time where climate change actually was discussed in the mainstream news in a way that we want that kind of urgency, that it should be discussed and not just an environmental section of the news. And I think it's partly contributed by the Biden's Climate Leaders Summit. There was this whole uproar about why Malaysia was not invited, and the local CSO was wondering, what are we not doing enough as a country that we're not recognized by the US? So there was a lot of mixed reactions around there. And I think this forces the ministry to come up with a statement to address, which is quite rare when they're quite reactionary. So climate change, took the stage this week. So among some of the things that they announced is that they have formed this new council called the Malaysian Climate Change Action Council, which is going to consist of state government leaders, local leaders, but no CSOs for some reason. And then they also talk about the low carbon mobility development plan and national low carbon city master plan. So there are a lot of plans being rolled out, and whether it works or not remains to be seen. And also, quite interestingly, lately there is a group of environmental lawyers suggesting that the Malaysian Parliament to introduce laws that allow future generations, whether they're unborn infants or children, to file suits to preserve nature. So this is the first I've ever heard in Malaysia, and it's quite progressive in a way that this is actually being brought up. But on the other side of things is like business is still going on as usual. Our national oil company is still expanding their production, and there's still a lot of plans to de-gazette forest reserve for the sake of urbanization pressures, land reclamation that will decimate a productive coast which have been supporting artisanal fishermen for generations. So it's one thing to roll out with very nice paper policies, but when you look at what they do on the ground, it's quite completely opposite, and you start to wonder whether they are really serious about it or they just want to look good on paper. And so what I'm encouraged is that the CSOs in Malaysia are stepping up, and they're increasingly networking among each other. And I'm glad that even the narrative on net zero is, I think, mainly debunked among the CSOs in Malaysia, because our main Petronas oil and gas company is saying that they are going to go net zero by 2050. So people, and because they have such a prominent position in the country. So, and generally the climate change awareness in Malaysia is quite low. So it seems that whatever, even though the biggest polluter, whatever they say that they're going to do, it seems like a very progressive move. But thankfully, we managed to debunk that net zero is really a hollow pledge, and more CSO are, taking a more critical stand around this.
Thank you, Evelyn. We might come back to some of those reflections on state-owned oil companies shortly, but Sephora, your round of good, bad, ugly glimmers of hope.
Thanks, Alex. I'm going to start with the ugly. I was really disappointed this morning to read that Canada and the US and Saudi Arabia and others had joined together to announce this new net zero producers forum. It is, in my opinion, the height of greenwash for the largest fossil fuel producers in the world to be creating a net zero production of fossil fuels forum. Like, it's crazy, right? They want us to have a conversation about reaching zero while they continue to expand the bad stuff. You don't get to zero by growing the problem. And this is exactly what the fossil fuel industry wants. The fossil fuel industry for years has been trying to make themselves invisible. Don't talk about the production of fossil fuels, talk about emissions. Do you know the words oil, gas, and coal and fossil fuels don't even appear in the Paris Agreement because they have made themselves invisible. in order to make people feel guilty, it's you use the product. If you're demanding it, we're supplying it, nothing we can do. You know, it's like the tobacco industry saying, you're smoking it, so we just make it. It's a gift to society. No, it's not a gift to society. And the fact is that if we are really going to get to zero and beyond zero, we need to protect our existing ecosystems. You know, the best, I loved this Twitter debate that was happening between an indigenous leader from the Shuar Nation, from the heart of the Amazon, and Elon Musk's team last night. Did anyone see that? Because Elon Musk has put out this prize, the X Prize, for the best carbon removal technology, $100 million from the heart of the Amazon. This indigenous leader tweets at them, I have your technology. It's called a tree. And if you would stop cutting ours down, we would be sequestering carbon. And I was killing myself because that's it, right? Like we're logging the last of the primary forests, and which are in effect carbon removal technologies. Then we're promising to do all of these BECCS, or we're going to plant grasses the size of India every year and cut them down, and then we're gonna these technologies are all factored in to the companies and countries' models that say they're going to be net zero. So we need those producers to cap production. They actually need to stop producing the problem and manage a wind down of the problem in order to get to zero. So we need absolute emissions and production decline if we're going to really face the climate emergency. And every ton of carbon at this moment in history that we don't emit saves lives. So the idea that we're using carbon dioxide removal and carbon capture and storage technologies in order to justify increased carbon emissions at this moment in history, I think is immoral. And I think that's what we're seeing with this new, coalition. I mean, just look at who's in it. The US, Canada, Norway, the UK, Saudi Arabia. What do all those countries have in common? They're making a lot of money by continuing to produce oil and gas, and it's killing us. So we need them to stop hiding behind net zero and start talking about absolute emissions reductions. So that's the really ugly stuff. And I just flipped to the really good stuff. What Candy mentioned. I mean, I think there was a lot that was good in this summer. And I think overall, when you look at the big picture, the fact that the US is back talking about climate change, that we don't have a crazy person in the White House that is just, saying crazy narcissistic things on Twitter all the time. Remember that? And denying climate change. I mean, Biden's not perfect, but what Biden has done in the last 3 months, what that administration has done in the last 3 months, puts most countries to shame for what they've done in the last 10 years. And they're treating climate change as a priority, not just in the climate policy, but in all aspects of the budget and all aspects of policy. Our stimulus money from COVID, what we spend money on, what we build, what we plan for, all of it right now should have a climate lens. That's what being in a climate emergency means. And I think we're starting to see that from the Biden administration. And ending the day with California announcing the end to oil and gas. I mean, the timelines aren't perfect. There's stuff in it that you would like to change, I would like to change, and certainly people living right next to the oil drilling would like to change, because we didn't see the 2,500 foot setbacks in what he announced. But the point is, we just had one of the largest economies in the world, where more people live than all of Canada, by the way, as a Canadian, say that this was the end of oil and gas, and that they're going to phase it out, and that there would be no more fracking permits. This is a game changer, followed by Denmark earlier this year. So we're starting to see countries actually, and subnationals actually admitting that they have to wind down all fossil fuel production. And I think that once we can actually get both the supply and the demand moving, that's when, that gives me hope.
Thank you all for sharing both those hard and difficult realities that we're living with, as well as those sources of hope that we have. And I want to open up actually for questions from from folks who are participating in this webinar who aren't on the panel. Encourage you can write a question in the chat, and folks might be able to respond to it. So we got a question from Dennis. How did this begin? The Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty idea? Yes.
Yeah.
Well, Zipporah, you might.
Yeah. We talk about it a lot, like where did the genesis of the idea come from? Here's my take. It was about 6 years or so that a bunch of us were sitting around, I think in New York, talking about how we had movement organizing around coal. We had movement organizing around climate policy moments like the UN climate change negotiations and climate policy, but that we actually had no network of groups that worked on oil and gas. There were regional networks, but people who were fighting Keystone and people who were fighting tar sands and people who were fighting oil drilling in Norway or fracking in Argentina, we weren't talking to each other yet. We'd never talked to each other. And I think it was because it's very disparate parts of the movement. Like you had the kind of demand side people who worked on coal and electricity, and the folks who were fighting frontline projects of oil and gas weren't really part of the climate movement almost. Anyway, so we decided to create the Global Gas and Oil Network, which we did create. And at that first inaugural strategy meeting, we were sitting around talking about, well, how would you really end the production of fossil fuels? And I think my memory is it was Richard Dennis, an economist from the Australia Institute, who said, we need like a nuclear non-proliferation treaty. We actually need a treaty that stops the expansion because it's really hard for a lot of countries to do it on their own. And everyone argues that they wouldn't be competitive. My own prime minister, by the way, 2 years ago, stood up at a conference and said, no sane leader would leave billions of dollars of oil in the ground, and he's going to eat those words, I think, pretty soon. But because Canada wants to be a leader on climate change, but we're the only G7 country whose emissions haven't gone down. And that's because of oil and gas. Emissions just from producing oil and gas is now the largest component of Canada's emissions, more than transportation, more than anything else. It's just from the production. And 80% of the emissions from a barrel of oil or gas come from where it's consumed when it leaves our country. So that's how much is being produced. Yes, Candy, the tar sands she put in the chat. Anyways, I get back to my origin stories. So we had this initial idea that started filtering out through conversations that were being coordinated by the Stockholm Environment Institute, through the Oxford Fossil Fuel Supply conferences, etc. And then some academics started writing about the idea. So I read an article by Andrew Sims and Peter Newell in a climate policy journal about the idea. Could we create a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty? And so I contacted them and I said, you know what, we've been talking about this too. And they said, oh yeah, we're talking to some of the same people, it's happening. And that was probably about 3 years ago. And a bunch of us started convening, but it was really off the sides of our desks. I couldn't get any funders interested in it. And it seemed people told me that it was too crazy, it was too bold. Oh, another treaty would even never happen. We just got Paris, we don't need it. And it was a real kind of uphill battle. And things just started shifting after the UN production gap report, when people started realizing that there was a real, not just emissions gap, but a production gap. So we continued convening our small working group. And then about 1.5 years ago, I won the Climate Breakthrough Award, which was kind of, out of the blue and awesome. And it doesn't happen very often. They give it to about 2 or 3 people a year. And it's to people who want to take big chances and want to direct bold global projects that might be climate game changers, basically. And so I won this award and they gave me $2 million. And I committed to spend that $2 million to support groups around the world and a research agenda to try and make the Fossil Fuel Treaty a reality. So we created the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative, hired Alex as the director, and started reaching out to groups around the world. And it's grown really fast. Some days it feels like a wild horses that you're holding on to. Just again, last week, Los Angeles became the first city in the United States to endorse the concept of a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. Vancouver has already endorsed it. Barcelona has endorsed it. And again, if you look at history, with nuclear non-proliferation, it was cities getting excited and endorsing the concept of non-proliferation that ended up adding up to force their nation states. And so the campaign is growing, and we have a steering committee that is representative of indigenous nations and women and civil society, peace and security groups. Now we have 100 Nobel laureates, including the Dalai Lama, that has endorsed the concept, which just, I can't even believe this is happening. And we newly put up a campaign hub with resources for groups around the world. And it's, I find going to work every day now just so fun. Like the other day, you know, Friends of the Earth Sweden launched a campaign in 19 cities or something. It's in Swedish. I can't really understand it, but it's like every day there's new there's new fossil fuel treaty campaigns. Like people are just taking it and running with it, the resources that we produce. And I think that's the way to go. No one owns the idea. We're going to produce a bunch of resources so any group in the world can run with it. But I think the idea is that it makes us greater than the sum of our parts. And these are some of the most powerful corporations in the world. We need to be greater than the sum of our parts.
Thank you, Sephora. I might ask Candy and Evelyn just to share how it started for you. How did this come into your radar? Because everyone will have a different way of having got engaged with it. Candy first.
Okay, well, because of you guys, you know, calling up the Indigenous Environmental Network, letting us know that this was happening, talking to us, what, a year or two ago? It's been a while. Like, what do you think about this concept? I was trying to find something else, and in my email chains, it brought this up, and I was just looking back through all the conversations and the messages and the back and forth, and like, yeah, this sounds really good. What kind of capacity do you need? Because this is huge. Like, what do you need from us? You know, because it's always this balance, right? Of like, we do need to do this to push forward, and we do not need to burn ourselves out and not be able to help. And so it was just like, okay, what can we do to help? How do we get on board? And then officially signing on, and then making it a part of our page. And then, you know, going out to our constituents, going out to our network, going out to the people, and really having workshops and explaining what this is, doing panels like this so that it can grow even more than it already has and become a true reality. And so I feel so pessimistic sometimes. Like, I've gotten so pessimistic over the years, but I do feel really energized and hopeful to be having these conversations, and to know that even though, you know, things need to move even faster in terms of stopping our emissions, there has to be a place where we're starting from and going from, a place to that just transition. And this is one of the tools in the toolbox that is really exciting and really necessary. And it's, like I said, thanks to you guys calling us up and saying, hey, we got this cool idea. What do you think?
Evelyn, thank you for sharing that, Candy. What about you, Evelyn?
I think it started in Madrid COP. A mutual friend connected us to Sephora. We sat down for a few sessions at the canteen, and we were talking about this. To me at that time was such a radical idea about, you know, Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, and coming from a country that depends on fossil fuel for its development, that sounds like a crazy idea. And I'm not too sure how I'm going to bring this back. So I'm glad to be part of the team, the research team especially, where I was commissioned to do a study on Petronas. So I like that that the treaty initiative took into consideration that, you know, transition is not the same throughout the world, and we need to understand the context issue, right? So by doing that, I think I understood more about how the oil and gas government-owned company in my own country operates, and just how expensive it is, and how deeply embedded in every, you know, system, socioeconomic system of it. So having this study landscape right in front of me, and I began to understand how we're going to start transitioning. And I think that was a very valuable study to me, and we're still going to have like a follow-up study where we're going to bring this to our local civil societies to just, you know, introduce it to them, and also to talk to the major stakeholders themselves, like our central bank and Petronas themselves, and really like ask them, have you been thinking about just transition? Manage decline. So these are concepts which we don't really hear them say at all. So at most we hear them say about, you know, net zero again, and ESG, environmental social governance principles, which they're just still developing, and climate risk disclosure. So these are just, I feel, quite piecemeal approaches to probably trying to address the same thing. But I think the initiative would really galvanize and put a spotlight on everything and how we can move together as soon as we can and as just as we can.
Thank you, Evelyn. Yeah, and that experience also in Colombia about the thinking that's actually gone on at the state-owned oil company about what the transition is going to mean for it as an entity and for its relationship to the state and workers is one that is, yeah, very spotty and very poorly considered. And so thank you for your work on that. We had a question in the chat about whether there's a current draft of the treaty, whether we're in a consensus building phase. So it's a little bit about kind of the pathway to really getting signatures and so on, and what steps will be taken. So I might just do a quick update of where we're at on that, and then I ask you to share some thoughts. So we haven't drafted a full treaty. We've been given the advice that it's better to stay at a principles level, because if you get too much detail and write up the whole thing yourself, you'll then put people offside, and they'll quibble with one thing on page 17, and you won't be able to advance the conversation. So you're better off staying at the principle level. And at the moment, we have the 3 key principles that the treaty needs to end expansion, have an equitable phase out, and deliver a just transition for all. And we do want to do and over the next year with our partners, have conversations which will generate some more detailed principles that might sit under those or sit alongside those in terms of guiding what we think this needs to do. And that might be the question, so you can get ready, panelists, that I'll come back to, is like the types of principles you think are important to think about as we advocate for a treaty. But just in terms of the timeline, we're hopeful that over the next year, we're going to see more and more folks coming out calling for this international approach to addressing the fossil fuel system. Obviously, we've had the Nobel laureates. We're looking forward to a coalition of parliamentarians calling for a treaty from across the world, for scientists and academics and researchers to come out and support, and also then heading into the COP at the end of this year, some governments putting this front and center. So at the summit, Biden summit this week, actually, the Prime Minister of Spain directly referenced the letter from the Nobel laureate saying we need to have a global focus on ending expansion. So that's like a first step. And we also know that many of the small island states, particularly those in the Pacific, they've already called for a global treaty on coal. They've already called for Australia's climate contribution to end the coal industry in Australia. And so we're also looking forward to seeing how they might champion a version of this. And then the process will be that it will get into the UN system, and there will be some form of commission or UN mandated report that will then form a basis for a formal negotiation. But there's something important I just want to say, which is that international law doesn't just happen out of nowhere. It reflects what governments are doing and demanding. It's an indicator of where governments already are. And so the best way that we're going to be able to push for this global treaty is by pushing governments to already act in the way that we want the treaty to be, because that's going to create what we call a changing of the global norms, which changes international law, which will then create the pressure for the treaty. So yes, there's a bit of a timeline out to where we think we might start negotiating formally an international agreement, but our focus isn't just on pushing for that kind of small process at the UN over that time. Our energy is in driving the actual practice of countries to start taking on these commitments, because that's how you build real international commitment to an idea. So hopefully that answers your question a bit, Mackenzie, and I'll I'll share now with the panelists their thoughts on kind of principles they think will be important and steps that they're looking forward to seeing along the way. We can start. Does anyone want to start?
Yeah, I'll start. You know, sometimes there are critics of the treaty from, you know, because it's such a surprise, like it's so bold, and people don't understand. I mean, I actually heard the Prime Minister the UK Boris Johnson was being asked in the House about the treaty, and he said, "Well, I mean, to stop fossil fuel production, that's what the Paris Accord does." I was like, no. You know, there are very few mechanisms within the Paris Accord to actually constrain fossil fuel production. I mean, countries could make decisions about their national policies and regulations, and then they could put them in their NDCs. They could create wind downs within their NDCs. And I think Stockholm Environment Institute has done some good work on this, where they put some papers on what are the possible supply side policies and mechanisms within the Paris Accord. But the idea of the treaty is that it would help achieve the Paris Accord by dealing with this overproduction and lock-in of fossil fuel infrastructure and production, and also the political lock-in that we see, you know, where they continue to be able to negotiate billions of dollars in subsidies, even though, you know, countries are saying they want to move away from fossil fuels. So I think we need to change the conversation, and we've grown up with this idea that fossil fuels are prosperity, that expansion of fossil fuels is good for us, and we really need to change the norm around fossil fuels. And I think that part of doing that is saying, no, now we know. We didn't know before, so it's not anyone's fault, and there are good people everywhere, even in the fossil fuel industry, but now we know that these are products that are killing us, that threaten global security, and we have alternatives. And so that narrative and that conversation we can have through this campaign, and that's why I like it, because every time someone signs on, LA endorses the motion. Well, now this morning we woke up to big articles in Los Angeles newspapers about the fossil fuel treaty. It makes it an option in people's heads. And that was necessary for every other big treaty. And Nobel laureates, 100 of the world's smartest people, have said this is a good idea. Better look at what that's about. And so there's so many options as a campaigner, like as an organizer, there are so many options. You can get cities to endorse, you can get citizens, scientists, teachers. And when they do, they're saying no fossil fuel expansion anywhere. So instead of just fighting against Trans Mountain or against oil drilling in the Amazon or against Standing Rock or against Line 3 or, you know, new oil drilling in Uganda, we're saying no, nowhere, none of it. And in that way, we're uniting all these frontline struggles. So we have a very powerful divestment movement that is growing, and powerful work on, you know, stop the money pipeline and banks. And we need to continue that work. No one's saying stop doing that campaigning. That's the financial side. But if we only work on the financial side, then we're leaving it to the markets. I don't think capitalism has worked that well for us. So we don't want to leave it just to the markets. We need governments to take a stand. We need to hold governments to account. And so you can work on finance campaigns, and you can also call on governments to endorse the fossil fuel treaty and keep creating this conversation and growing this conversation about the treaty, and about the need for international cooperation to stop expansion. And, you know, and I will also say that as a campaigner, I don't think we've had anything that globally united the movements. It's maybe Copenhagen, maybe Paris, but what we were saying, increase ambition. Like, this actually unites us all around the world in saying one thing to our governments: stop expansion, support this treaty, support the fossil fuel treaty, support stopping fossil fuel expansion. It unites us all, and it's bold. And we're running out of time. So we need stuff that's bold. We need big new ideas that are bold. And I'm tired of working on incremental change. So this campaign I find really exciting for those reasons. I want to also explain for folks just really briefly, Alex, how we're doing it. And I thought I actually might just, if it works, share my screen, but if I can. No, I can't, but that's okay. I'll just explain it. So we've created a hub of people, Alex and I and a number of others, and we're kind of like a core global hub. And we're in service to anyone who wants to run a campaign. And we're trying to keep you all connected. Because, I mean, we have groups now in India and many countries in Africa, all over Europe, North America, etc. And so we're producing resources for the different strategies. So you want to get your city to endorse or cities to endorse. Here's the draft motion for your council. Here's a package to figure out how to campaign for the Fossil Fuel Treaty on cities. You know, the Nobel laureates do their thing. We produce a video and press releases, and anyone can strip off our logo and put their logo on the press release and send them out. We're trying to produce resources so that they just go out everywhere and keep everybody connected. So we have a cities coordinator, a digital coordinator, communications experts, and a couple of other people that are kind of making up the hub. And then we think of it as spokes out, and then we have a youth group council. Are they calling themselves a youth council now, Alex? A group of youth from Fridays for the Future and other students movements who have now come together to create a youth group for treaty. And
Youth
they're youth, what are they calling them? A youth space, a youth space. And we have a research group, a political working group, and a campaign working group that are open to any group that has endorsed treaty. If you want to be a part of the global working groups, come on, we need more people. And those global working groups try and create key moments that everyone can participate in, or resources that everyone can participate in. So it's new, and we're kind of building it right now from the ground up, and we're co-creating with all these groups who have started to take it on. And it's pretty exciting to watch it emerging around the world.
Thanks, Sephora. Evelyn?
Well, I think for me, to support this global movement to move away from fossil fuels, for countries to have extensive long-term planning on economic diversification and industrial restructuring, I do wish that the movement against non-proliferation could move in the same momentum at the international level as how it would at the national level. But it does feel like at the national level, you're wading through a more dense, a situation that would pull you back a lot of times. So like the government-owned agents, energy companies in developing countries play a very substantial role because it's integrated with its development and policy architecture. So it's not really just about replacing dirty fuel with clean energy. It also requires a very profound overhaul and redesign of the existing socioeconomic structure at a very unprecedented scale across all policy space and all layers of society. So for example, if I would say Petronas, for example, a state-owned company in Malaysia where I'm from, it's been operating since the 1970s, and it provides about 20% of the national income, and this revenue goes into Malaysia Development Fund. So it recently became an even more important source of income for the economic injection that helped keep Malaysians afloat in the unrelenting waves of COVID-19 pandemic. So expecting Petronas to shut down tomorrow or the next month or the next year will really cause massive destabilization, unlike the privately owned companies whose profit go into private stakeholders' pocket. So in that sense, government-owned agency companies are different. So our effort over here will be focused on helping countries like Malaysia to transition justly. So at the national level, we are already pushing for coal phase out and pressuring Petronas to embark on plans for just transition and managed decline. And we're also hoping the youth of Malaysia would increasingly voice out their concern about energy that moving forward into their future. Because as it is, a lot of the CSOs are now focused on very tangible environmental issues like deforestation or land reclamation. But because oil production in Malaysia, or at least anywhere else it finds itself in the world, happens offshore. So it is not something visual. It's not something that you can see lands are being grabbed and people are being displaced. So it is that out of mind, out of sight, out of mind issue. And also because Petronas has built such a how do you call it? Like a very reputable position in Malaysia, and it's likely one of the most coveted jobs that people are looking for because it pays so well, and people just cannot imagine what would Malaysia do without Petronas, without oil. So my hope is that through this initiative, we would start to carve ways and really shake off our paradigm that we cannot live without oil. We need to put our attention in how do we live without oil, how do we even start thinking around that. And there's a lot of work to be done over there, and we do need that help in capacity building and financial and technology transfer. And really, it's not just about replacing dirty fuel with clean fuel. It's so much more than that.
Thank you so much, Evelyn. And Candy, looking forward.
Yes. Yes to everything Evelyn just said. Thank you for keeping it real. You know, the reality of our overconsumption in the United States, particularly around energy, is just so sickening. We're not trying to say, let's continue to use renewables so that we can waste as much energy as we do now, because that is a step in the wrong direction. There also is no one size fits all for the just transition world. There is a difference in what's going to work in my state of North Dakota, for example, which is very rural, where we can have these huge hemp farms, and, you know, we can have small scale distributed wind and solar, honestly, because if we're talking about, let's replace and go corporate, everything big, let's have big, huge wind farms and big, huge solar farms. What about the batteries? What about the issues we're coming up with digging in indigenous people's lands to get those precious metals and minerals and displacing people still that way? That is not going to be the answer moving forward, because we've already had people that have come to us and say, look, this isn't working. So I want to just say that there's traditional knowledge, there's traditional ecological knowledge, there's indigenous knowledge. And that concept, which is not based in fiction, it's based in fact. We have lived on this land for thousands of years without oil and gas. We don't have to prove it. We've already done it. What we have to do, like you said, is change our mindset of what we need, and the propaganda machine that tells us through our televisions and our radio stations and certain podcasts what we need, and have a reframing of what we actually need. In reality, to survive and to be and thrive on this planet, we need clean air to breathe. Check. We need clean water to drink. Check. And we need clean soil to grow our crops and our food in. Those are the natural resources that we need to be protecting the most. Those are the natural resources that are being polluted the most by the fossil fuel industry. And so it's this whole thought process of turning what we have, which is currently a negative feedback loop, turning it into a positive feedback loop where it's cradle to cradle instead of cradle to the grave, where we are thinking about the systems of oppression and how that has changed our mindset into a colonized way of thinking, especially here in the United States. Decolonizing our mindsets is a huge part of this, and it's hard. It's hard because that's what we've been growing up with and brainwashed into and propagandized into thinking is the way forward. So much so that so many of our own people are lost and in that same frame of mind. We need to remember our languages, because if we lose our languages as Indigenous peoples, we lose that culture and that cultural foundation, that spiritual connection. Whether you identify as a white person, a Black person, a Native American person, a Hispanic person, a Latino, however you identify, no matter what, we are all made up, our bodies physically, of the earth. This is why if you go outside and stand on the grass or lay down on the ground, you physically start to feel better. If you go into a forest and you stand by a tree, you physically start to feel better because there's medicine in the bark. What we need to do in addition to all of this and the paperwork is to reaffirm our connection with the sacred, because we all have blood memory of what it means to be made up of the land. And that's why we're sick. is because when what we do to the land, we do to ourselves. It sounds native, it sounds cliche, but it's just such a simple, common sense reality. And that's what I love about our youth. They get it. They understand that. The groups in Australia, I hope you're meeting with SEED, with the Aboriginal Youth Council and with the Australian Youth Climate Council, and all of us that have been screaming for years, listen to us. Just because we're kids doesn't mean we don't know what we're talking about, because we have had that understanding and that grasp on reality for quite some time. And again, that's why this kind of a treaty is exciting, because it gives us that thing, that physical, tangible thing that we can say, see, other people agree with us too.
Thank you so much, Candy, for bringing that truth
So
to it.
awesome.
It was so awesome. And I want to thank all three of you for bringing both the realities and the challenges that we face, and not sugarcoating, not pretending that it's like an easy challenge that we're up against, but also bringing it apart in terms of the hope and the vision and the ideas for how we could do it differently, and the pathway that we can do it differently together. We might end our discussion here with Dennis's question about getting involved. Everybody is very welcome to get involved. You can endorse as an individual or as an organization. We'll capture your email as well. If you're a young activist and you want to get involved in the global youth space, we'll take your email and Brenna can make sure that you're connected into that space. We encourage you to check out the campaign hub, where if you want to take up a local campaign, either on your local government or your national government, you'll find materials there that you can adapt and use as a basis for your work. As Sephora said, this is an idea we're putting out into the world. It's not about our logo or brand or anything like that. Like, find the way that works for you to articulate the demand, and please make the most of it. And feel free also to follow on social. We're on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, and so there'll be materials there. And we try and amplify and lift up voices of others making the calls aligned with the treaty's values as well. So thank you all so much. The three of you on the panel, for a really inspiring discussion. This will be my good piece of the week. I've loved what the ground we've covered. Thank you for those who've turned up, the questions that you've asked, the time that you've given to listen and think and feel and reflect on this. And a huge thanks to the PowerShift Network for this awesome convergence that you've pulled together. I think I've been on two or three panels now, and everyone has been so amazing, inspiring. I've seen it in my Twitter feed, and I'm really excited to see the change that you're all going to bring into the world. So thank you, everybody.